This video is a review of the primary events of the Protestant Reformation in England and in Scotland in the 16th century, and also a look at the Counter-Reformation as well as the explosion of European witchcraft in the 16th century. The Reformation in England is sometimes debated whether it should be called the Reformation in England or England's Reformation. The question is, did something unique happen in England that is very different than what had happened in the Holy Roman Empire or in France or in the Dutch Republic? The events of the Reformation in England center around the House of Tudor. The Tudor family was a new family in the history of dynasties in England. It had emerged out of the very complex and conflicting years of the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses was this dynastic war between these two families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And after several decades of war and conflict and rival claimants for the throne in short-lived terms and a very weak monarchy, it is finally a minor family of the House of Lancaster, known as the Tudors, led by Henry Tudor, who earns victory on the battlefield, the Battle of Bosworth Field, defeating the Yorkists, who claims the throne, and skillfully, very crafty moves, marries a member of the House of York, thus uniting the two families, Elizabeth of York. And so Henry Tudor establishes the Tudor dynasty. So very important for the events of the Reformation in England is always this question is, how long can the Tudor dynasty last? The shadow of the War of the Roses and other families, various strains of Yorkists and other families are waiting in the wings if the Tudors fail to claim the throne of England. So very significant is that Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York's marriage does produce children, and particularly male heirs. The oldest is Arthur Tudor, who in his teenage years marries the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. But before Arthur can ascend to the throne, he dies unexpectedly from illness. That leads to the second son, Henry Tudor, to be the heir to the throne, who before his ascension also marries his brother's wife, Catherine of Aragon, which of course will have very great significance later on. So Henry VIII comes to the throne in 1509 upon the death of his father and will reign until 1547. Henry is a very charismatic individual, athletic, proficient in multiple languages, and areas of expertise, academic subjects. He's also a wrestler. He famously meets Francis I, the King of Spain, at the Field of the Cloth of Gold and wrestles the king and gets thrown into the mud. Henry VIII is a devout son of the Catholic Church, very concerned about what he calls the Lutheran heresy, and finances or supports, perhaps writes a portion of the assertion of the seven sacraments, in which he defends the seven sacraments of the church against the Lutheran teaching that there were only two sacraments of the church. For this work, the Pope gives him a special title, Fidei Defensor, which is defender of the faith, which is, of course, highly ironic given subsequent history. One of the leading intellectual and linguists of Henry's early reign is William Tyndale. Tyndale converts to Protestantism and the teachings of the Reformed faith and uses his remarkable language abilities, he knew 7 languages, to begin the translation of the Bible. Unable to find a financier and a publisher in England, he is forced to flee to the continent, where he translates the Old and the New Testament Bible into English. This was the most up-to-date and most accurate translation, far exceeded the value of the Wycliffe Bible. And later on, the King James Bible, which will be the primary Bible of the English-speaking world, is primarily 4/5 the work of William Tyndale. Because of his illegal activities in translating the Bible into English, he is eventually arrested and he is burned at the stake. His last words are, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," thus pleading that the Reformation and the gospel would eventually convert Henry and eventually all of England. That prayer is answered to some extent in a very bizarre and unexpected manner. By the late 1520s, around the Tudor court, people begin to privately gossip about what is nicknamed the King's Great Matter. And the King's Great Matter is, of course, the fact that he does not have an heir to the throne. His wife, of course, is Catherine of Aragon, who is his former brother's wife, and had borne Henry one daughter. This is his oldest child, legitimate child, Mary Tudor. However, Henry does not have what he really needs, which is a male heir. Of course, the Tudor dynasty is always on shaky ground at the beginning of the 16th century, and so what is really needed is a male heir. Catherine is getting older, and it doesn't seem that Catherine is going to produce that male heir. Henry, who has a very famous wandering eye, starts to distance himself from his wife and starts to pay more attention to the daughter of a merchant at court, Thomas Boleyn, whose daughter's name is Anne Boleyn. Henry has already fathered a child with Anne's sister and now finds himself quite attracted to Anne Boleyn for her vivacious personality and his belief that she could produce a male heir. So therefore, Henry seeks the advice and consent of his chancellor and a very prominent cardinal in England, Thomas Wolsey, to solicit the endorsement and permission from the Pope to be granted a special dispensation to annul his or grant a divorce from his relationship to Catherine of Aragon and permit him to marry Anne Boleyn. Thomas Wolsey fails in this endeavor. As a result, he is removed from his position of chancellor. The second chancellor, also called Thomas, who's given this task, is Thomas More, the very famous Christian humanist who wrote Utopia. Thomas More is a loyal son of the Catholic Church, and he also fails in this effort to get Henry a divorce. Therefore, he is removed and eventually beheaded. It is Thomas Cromwell, the king's secretary, who finally comes up with a solution here in which to make the king the head of the church instead of the Pope, and thus giving the king the power to grant himself his own divorce and thus marry Anne Boleyn. This is, of course, what occurs. Henry declares the authority of Rome null and void in England, forms the Anglican Church, makes himself the head of the church, grants himself a divorce, and then secretly marries Anne Boleyn. And then a few months later, she gives birth not to a boy, but rather to a girl, and this is, of course, Elizabeth Tudor. So the Reformation in England is very unique, very different than what occurs on the continent. It has much to do with the king's marital interests and the desire for an heir than it does actual reform by pastors and theologians. You might think of the Reformation in England as top-down, whereas the Reformation in Switzerland and in Germany is bottom-up. It's from pastors and preachers like Luther and Calvin. In England, it's top-down. It is from the monarch himself. It is also a reformation achieved by the Parliament and by statutory law. So there's a series of laws passed by the Parliament and endorsed by Henry that establish Henry the head of the church and that all clergy must submit to him and not to the Pope. The Pope no longer has any authority over the church in England, and that all heirs through his marriage to Anne Boleyn will be the legitimate heir to the throne. And if you disagree, then you are charged with treason and would be executed. To also secure his reformation in England, the king dissolves all of the monasteries in England. These monasteries, owned and controlled by the Roman Catholic Church, of course, were sources of great wealth and influence in the countryside. And so by seizing their lands and their wealth, this is, of course, an enormous boon to the king's finances, and he will eventually sell off this land to an emerging gentry class that's going to have a vested economic interest in the success and continuance of the Reformation in England. Now, the response to Henry's Reformation is small, and generally the population is forced to go along with this and not support the Roman authority anymore in England. The Anglican Church of Henry has been described as Roman Catholicism without Rome. it is Catholicism without the Pope. So the Anglican Church of Henry's reign still practices transubstantiation, still believes in purgatory and the worship of Mary and all these traditional Catholic doctrines, except there is no Pope and there is no authority of Rome in England. The only real violent response that is seen against Henry's Reformation is what is called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which emerges in the north. Northern England, and particularly Scotland, is always a difficult area for English monarchs to control, and is essentially a large-scale protest and a march towards the south. Henry sends his troops north, and eventually over 200 leaders and participants of the Pilgrimage of Grace are arrested, tortured, and executed, often in the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn, therefore, is Henry VIII's second queen. She does not remain in the king's good graces for long, however. She fails to produce another child besides Elizabeth Tudor, and eventually Henry suspects her of plotting against her, and so she is sent to the Tower of London, where finally in 1536, despite her pleas for mercy, she is beheaded in the Tower of London at this site in the middle of the courtyard. Anne Boleyn is replaced by Henry's third wife, who is Jane Seymour, who certainly does have Protestant sympathies. She was Henry's favorite wife and indeed does finally give Henry a male heir in Edward. However, Jane dies in childbirth. So now Henry has a male heir to the throne, but he no longer has a wife. He has now divorced the first, beheaded the second, and the third dies in childbirth. He therefore, upon the recommendation of Thomas Cromwell, marries Anne of Cleves, who is from the continent, but he took very little delight in her, spends very little time with her, quickly divorces her. She is replaced by Catherine Howard, who essentially was a teenager when marries Henry, and she was unfaithful to him, and therefore the king has her executed. His sixth and final wife is Catherine Parr, who had strong Protestant sympathies, actually secretly promoting Protestant reform ideas at the Tudor court behind her husband's back. But indeed, Catherine Parr outlives Henry, who dies in 1547, Catherine Parr dying the following year. Those that oppose Henry's Reformation and seek a greater Reformation along the ideas of Lutheran or Reformed ideas are strongly persecuted in England. There are dozens and dozens of what are called Henrician martyrs. Most famous, perhaps, is Anne of Askew. Anne of Askew is on record of being one of the only woman in English history to not only be tortured but also beheaded for her faith at Smithfield. So Henry in his latter years has achieved something of a reformation in the sense that he has kicked the Pope out of authority, kicked the Pope out as far as the authority over the church in England, but it is unclear exactly what he has accomplished. He may have actually felt guilty about it in his latter years. It indeed still very much looks like a Catholic church that he passes over to his son upon his death in 1547. With Edward's ascension in 1547, what England has is a very young, inexperienced, but more significant, very sickly king. Therefore, as is common for a young king's reign, he is assigned regents. Edward's regents will be the first Duke of Somerset and also the first Duke of Northumberland. They exercise undue influence over Edward. They have strong Protestant sympathies, therefore lean on the young king to promote Protestantism and the further reform of the church in England. They also have designs for their own political power as well, using the king as their puppet, essentially. So Edward allows for the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had actually been appointed by Henry, to be given free reign over the Church of England. Cranmer produces the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, which is overtly Protestant and removes many of the vestiges of former Catholic teaching. The 42 Articles are a doctrinal statement that certainly advocate Protestantism, a very clear form of Protestantism. The problem for these Reformed regents, and also Thomas Cranmer himself, and this emerging Protestant cause in England, is that the king is very young and very sick. And indeed, he will not last long. He will only reign for close to 6 years and will die at approximately the age of 16. The problem for Protestants in England is that the next heir to the throne is not a boy, but is his oldest sister, who is Mary Tudor, who, of course, was the daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon, who has been raised in the Catholic Church and will reinstitute Catholicism in England. Therefore, there is this very brief attempt by the cousin of Edward to claim the throne for herself, who is a Protestant. This is Lady Jane Grey. She will only reign for 9 days, sometimes called the 9-Day Queen, in which she claims the throne of England to promote Protestantism and block the ascension of the Catholic Mary to the throne. However, she really does not have popular support, and she is sent to the Tower of London in 1554, where she is executed. So this leads to the ascension of Henry's oldest daughter, Mary I. Again, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, raised in the Catholic Church, a devout Catholic, and believes it is her mission to restore Catholicism in England, and she will earn the everlasting disdain of Protestants in England, particularly because of her marriage choice. She marries the very much hated Spanish king, Philip II, again, who had been designated the most Catholic of princes by the Pope himself. This is not a particularly close marriage, and it's certainly not a fruitful marriage. Mary will not bear any children through her marriage to Philip. Philip will be off in Spain quite frequently, leaving Mary alone. But it leads to Mary's increased unpopularity. As a result of her Catholicism reinstituting the Catholic Church and then beginning her persecution of Protestants in England, many English Protestants leave, known as the Marian exiles, wealthy individuals fleeing persecution because of their faith and going to places such as Geneva and also the Holy Roman Empire, or perhaps the Dutch Republic as well. Mary believes it will shore up her authority if she indeed does persecute the Protestants in England and makes some notable martyrs, which she does at Smithfield. Smithfield is this popular shopping area today in London today, but it was the area of where almost 300 religious dissenters, mostly Protestants and primarily women, are burned at the stake. There's also another group of martyrs martyred to the north at Oxford, known as the Oxford Martyrs. Most famous victims among the Oxford martyrs include Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, and also eventually Thomas Cranmer, who will be burned at the stake in 1556. This site in the middle of the street in Oxford commemorates where these martyrs were burned at the stake. The burning of the Oxford martyrs inspires another English Protestant to write a history of martyrdom for the true faith, known as the Acts and Monuments of the Martyrs of the Faith, written by John Fox. Mary Tudor, therefore, is kind of in a bad situation towards the end of her reign. Her health continues to fail. She has no heir to the throne, male or female, and she's becoming more and more widely unpopular because of her persecution of the Protestants. And once she dies in 1558, it leads to the ascension of her sister, her half-sister, Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. The most successful aspect of Elizabeth's reign is that she has a long reign from 1558 all the way to 1603, whereas Edward and Mary have short reigns and are not able to solidify their religious ideas and keep them imposed upon England. Elizabeth does have a long reign. She's enormously popular throughout England. There's, of course, enormous pressure upon her ascension to the throne for her to marry. Indeed, she does have several boyfriends or would-be suitors. There's actually a would-be suitor in Philip II, the King of Spain, but she was smart enough to know not to repeat the mistake of her sister and marry the very much hated King of Spain. Therefore, realizing that any marriage would really represent a diminishment of her authority and power, she decides not to marry. And so for the bulk of her reign, she is known as the Virgin Queen, the one who never marries, and rather proclaims herself as married to England. Regarding religion in England, She initiates what is called the religious settlement, perhaps could be called the Elizabethan compromise. She does, again, have Parliament pass an act of supremacy, which makes her the supreme governor of the church in 1558, and she also imposed the Act of Uniformity, which reestablishes the Anglican Church of her father. Rome will no longer, again, have any authority over England. Catholic teachings and doctrines are slowly, gradually, but significantly moved from the church. And she makes herself in charge of the church in England. As a result of this, Catholics now become the minority and out of favor, as where they were the religious group in favor during the reign of Mary. However, Elizabeth, learning from the reign of her sister Mary, does not persecute the Catholics in England as Mary did the Protestants. There are laws against being Catholic, and there are taxes, but often these laws are not enforced. The taxes are not imposed, and therefore there's a measure of toleration for Catholics if they just kept their religion quietly and did not plot against Elizabeth's throne. The Pope, in response to Elizabeth's ascension, issues a papal bull which excommunicated her and excommunicated all those that did not actively plot against their queen. The purpose of this bull was to get the English men and women to rise up against this Protestant queen. And in fact, has the opposite effect of getting many more English men and women to convert to Protestantism and submit to the Anglican Church and abandon Rome. Therefore, England becomes a bastion of Protestantism by the late 16th century. One of the threats that Mary faces against her authority and her throne is from her own cousin. This is Mary Stuart. If Elizabeth was to die, because there are no more children of Henry VIII, and Elizabeth has no children herself, the nearest heir to the throne would go to her cousin, who was the Queen of Scotland, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. She's a very devout Catholic. When the Scottish Reformation occurs, she loses her throne to the north. Elizabeth grants her safe passage and the ability to live in England if she promises not to be given to any plots against her authority. Mary Stuart does not follow through on that promise, and therefore Elizabeth signs her own cousin's death warrant in 1587, leading to the beheading of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the end of her plots against Elizabeth's throne. Elizabeth was very thrifty as far as the state budget goes. She was very much interested in attacking the Spanish treasure fleets that are coming back from the New World with a group of privateers and small emerging navy called the Sea Dogs, led by the very capable explorer Francis Drake. Sir Francis Drake is very famous for attacking the Spanish, also his circumnavigation of the world. And so because Elizabeth rejects Philip's marriage offers, and because Philip is interested in reestablishing Catholicism over England, and because he's also tired of these sea dogs attacking his treasure galleons coming from the New World, Philip launches the Spanish Armada in 1588. This is one of the largest fleets ever assembled. You remember Philip had earned the notable naval battle against the Ottomans at the Battle of Lepanto. And so believing that his navy was invincible, he endeavors to attack England, destroy their fleet, then land and invade England. But it is in the English Channel that the Sea Dogs, the smaller English ships that are more maneuverable and you could reload faster, meet the Spanish Armada in the Channel of these 130 ships and quickly attack them, destroying many of them. So in order not to be destroyed piecemeal, the Armada forms these large crescent formations, believing that they'll be immune from English attack as they move through the Channel. But of course, the English set fire to their own ships, these fire ships, and then push them towards these large assembled crescent formations of the Spanish galleons. They cannot get away fast enough, and so rather they burn to the waterline. Those ships that that escape the English fire ships continue north around the North Sea, where a very timely um, hurricane shipwrecked many of them along the Irish and Scottish coast. Still on the bottom of the English Channel, you can see some of the cannons destroyed by some of the English from the Spanish ships. So this is the defeat over the Spanish Armada is a major victory for Elizabeth and her reign in the English Reformation, and marks the end of Spanish power and influence throughout the world. Spain will see a gradual decline in their nation's power for centuries to come, whereas England is clearly on the rise as an imperial and particularly a naval power under the popularity of Elizabeth. Now, not everyone is completely happy with the religious settlement, the Elizabethan settlement of religion with the Anglican Church. We see the emergence of Puritanism towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. These devout followers of the church and readers of the Bible that believe the church is still too Catholic, the established Anglican Church is too Catholic and needs to be purified. They publish numerous tracts calling for the further purification of the church. Elizabeth really has no sympathy for their cause, but they are a very minor movement towards the end of her reign and will play a much more significant role in the coming century and eventually the English Civil War. So the Elizabethan era, we mean this era of enormous popularity for the Queen and also an explosion of the arts and sciences. Of course, the most famous writer of the English language lives and operates during Elizabeth's reign. This is William Shakespeare, the very famous playwright who wrote plays that were often performed at the Globe Theatre. The reconstruction of what you can see here. Elizabeth dies in 1603 with no male heir and is buried right next to, actually on top of her sister, in Westminster Abbey today. We move on now to talk about the Reformation in Scotland. Scotland also was a very traditional Catholic country with strong ties to France and the French Catholic monarchy, and it would seem very unlikely that Scotland would experience a Reformation. However, it is a series of pastors, reformers, and preachers that begin to preach the gospel and expound the scriptures in Scotland, gradually converting more men and women and prominent leaders to their cause. One of these earlier Scottish reformers is Patrick Hamilton, who earns the disgust of the local bishop and is burned at the stake in 1528. This marker indicates the site of his execution. St. Andrew's Castle, which is on the east coast of Scotland, plays a prominent role in the Scottish Reformation. These are the ruins of the previous headquarters of the very powerful, very devout Catholic prominent Archbishop of Scotland and of St. Andrews, David Beaton. He was determined to root out the Protestant cause, strangle it in the crib, and that led to the burning of Patrick Hamilton. It also leads to the execution of George Wishart. George Wishart was a traveling itinerant preacher throughout Scotland, preaching Reformed doctrines and expanding the Protestant church. His young bodyguard was also an aspiring preacher named John Knox. Wishart is eventually arrested and convicted by Colonel Beaton of heresy, and he too is burned at the stake. This marker indicates a monument to the martyrs. So, with the undue influence of Colonel Beaton in Scotland and the traditional alliance between the French monarchy and Scottish authorities, gradually there is a growing aversion towards the Catholic Church and international influence over Scotland by prominent nobles in Scotland known as the Lords of the Congregation. The Reformation in Scotland is different than many other areas in the sense that it is not a Reformation led by a monarch and not particularly a Reformation led by one significant reformer. But in many ways, it is accomplished because of an oligarchy, a group of nobles. This is Reformation by the nobility, which is somewhat unique in the 16th century. These lords of the congregation, these Scottish Reformed nobles, are so indignant and turned off to Cardinal Beaton that eventually have him assassinated in 1546. Now, we can't understand the Reformation in Scotland apart from what is occurring in England. We've already discussed the emergence of the Tudor dynasty in England with Henry VII, his son Henry VIII, who accomplishes the Henrician Reformation, and then his three children, Edward VI, who makes England more Protestant, Mary I, who reverts it to Catholicism, and Elizabeth I, who establishes a permanent Protestant Anglican church in England. Meanwhile, to the north, in Scotland, we have the traditional Stuart dynasty. Each of their monarchs famously named James, all of them James Stuart. And so James IV, his sister, he had famously married Margaret Tudor, who was the sister of Henry VIII, just thus aligning the Stuart and also Tudor dynasties. Their child was James V, who had been married to a Catholic queen in Mary of Guise, and their child was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, also Catholic, who was briefly married as a young girl to the King of France, Francis II. And it is Mary Stuart's second marriage that will produce James VI of Scotland, who eventually will be Elizabeth's heir, James I. So there's this long-standing traditional alliance between the Scottish monarchy and also the French monarchy, called the Auld Alliance, or the Auld Alliance in the Scottish brogue. The Auld Alliance ensured the Scots protection from English invasion and also English theology in the Reformation. The very strong and devout Catholic Queen of Scotland at the beginning of the middle of the 16th century was Mary of Guise, a very devout French Catholic queen. And there's constant warfare between England and Scotland. At one point, with Henry trying to marry his infant son Edward off to the Scottish queen, Mary of Guise, who's actually French, called the rough wooing. It leads to conflict. So it is, as late as the mid-16th century, it seems unlikely that England and Scotland will come together on religious issues and form an alliance. The traditional conflict and warfare still exists. Upon Mary of Guise's death in 1560, we see the ascension of Mary, Queen of Scots, who we've already talked about as a cousin of Elizabeth. She presides over much of Scotland, over Scotland, and when the lords of the congregation seek to have a reformation in Scotland, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, summons the French and French troops to surround many of the lords of the congregation at St. Andrew's Castle. Remember, this is Cardinal Beaton's castle where they had murdered him, and now the lords of the congregation and many Scottish nobles and reformers are located in this castle. There are secret tunnels that go in and out of this castle, and one of the young pastors and reformers at St. Andrews during the French siege is John Knox. Eventually, the French succeed in taking the castle and taking many of its inhabitants as prisoners, including John Knox. John Knox will serve briefly as a galley slave among the French, even promoting Protestant ideas among the French Catholic prisoners on this galley slave. He will eventually escape, make his way to Geneva. He'll study under Calvin. He will also spend some time in England, where he assists Thomas Cranmer in writing the Book of Common Prayer. He will spend some time in Frankfurt and also in Geneva, where he will teach at the Geneva Academy. He's a close associate of Calvin. While in Geneva, he publishes the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regimen of women. He obviously was opposed to female monarchs for what he viewed as their promotion of Catholic ideas, as seen in Mary of Guise and Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Of course, this is going to be an embarrassing pamphlet for him later on when Elizabeth ascends the throne of England. So John Knox returns to Scotland, continues to preach His preaching and his sermons lead to Protestant riots, which attack Catholic images and destroy Catholic statuary across churches in Scotland. Catholic priests are forced to run for their lives. The lords of the congregation seized the capital city of Edinburgh in 1559, depose Mary Guise, the French Queen of the Scots. The French endeavor to lay siege to the port, but Elizabeth herself from the south of England sends troops north to secure the Reformation in Scotland. So thus, finally, in 1560-1561, after the preaching of John Knox and the efforts of the lords of the congregation, we have the Reformation Parliament in Scotland pass the Scottish Confession of Faith, which is a reformed statement of doctrine. Papal authority is rejected, and the Mass is forbidden. This Reformation Parliament establishes the Kirk. The Kirk is the Scottish word for church. It is the state church, which is the Presbyterian church. Presbyterian churches are led by presbyters or elders. They promote Reformed theology and Reformed confessions, only worship as is commanded in the Scriptures, and prohibit those who are not regenerated from partaking at the table. John Knox has famous conversations with Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, who remains Catholic even though her country is Protestant. And of course, eventually Elizabeth will have her beheaded for her plots against her throne. John Knox is definitely the definitive leader of the Reformation in Scotland. His famous quote is, "Give me Scotland lest I die." So earnestly did he seek the reform of his country. And so thus we have, with Elizabeth in England, Anglicanism, and a Presbyterian church in Scotland. It's important to note the difference between those two. And so thus, with Elizabeth's death, we have the ascension of James VI, who eventually will form a dual monarchy over England and Scotland, the King of Scotland as James VI, and the King of England, he also claims Ireland, as James I. The Reformation continues in Scotland into the 17th century with the efforts of Andrew Melville, and the Scots will vigorously protest the efforts of the English king, King Charles I, son of James I, to impose a new, much more Anglican, high liturgy, much more Catholic-sounding prayer book in 1637. This leads to the famous effort to impose this prayer book on the Scottish churches, and Jenny Geddes standing up in St. Giles Cathedral and yelling at the bishop as he attempts to read from this Catholic-sounding prayer book, "Devil cause you colic in your stomach, false thief, dare you say the mass in my ear," picks up her stool and throws it at the bishop. And so this leads to the famous Bishop Wars, in which the Scots refuse this Anglican prayer book and its Catholic principles. And we have the formation of the Scottish Covenanter movement. The Covenanters, covenant or promise, come together in the writing of the National Covenant to resist Anglicanism, to resist episcopacy, the episcopal teachings of the Anglican Church in England, and they have to meet secretly because they are heavily persecuted by the King of England. They meet in secret church services called conventicles. It leads to mass persecution, particularly in the 1680s, as the Covenanters are meeting in secret, sometimes even meeting in graveyards. There are thousands of Covenanters who are massacred by the English monarchy for their refusal to give up the Scottish Kirk, refusal to submit to bishops who they believe are not regenerated, and seek to impose non-biblical teachings on them. The Scottish Covenanter revolt doesn't end until the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and the ascension of William and Mary to the throne of England, in which finally England and Scotland are unified in the Act of Union in 1707. As a side note to the Scottish Reformation, it is Francis Makemie who is the first colonizer in North America to bring Scottish Presbyterianism. He's known as the father of American Presbyterianism, as the founder of the Rehoboth Presbyterian Church in Westover, Maryland. Some final notes on the Reformation. We could talk about women and the role that women play in the Reformation, including key spouses of the prominent reformers, including Catherine von Bora, Idelette Calvin, and also Anna Zwingli, for their support of their husband's work. Also, other women who wrote tracts advocating for the teaching of the scriptures and the application of the scriptures as wives and mothers. Katharina Zell, Anne Boleyn, even as her time as Queen of England, secretly was promoting Catholic ideas and raised her daughter, Elizabeth Tudor, who eventually, of course, becomes monarch of England, in very Protestant ideas. The Roman Catholic Church and the Pope, of course, mount a vigorous response to the Protestant Reformation that is sometimes called the Counter-Reformation because it endeavors to counter the influence of the Protestants, also called the Catholic Reformation. There are many in the Catholic Church that realized the Church itself had become corrupt throughout the Middle Ages and needed to be reformed. We see this rise of lay piety, or desire for true religion, among many of the laity outside of the Church. People looking to mysticism for a true experience of God and a true touch of Christ's love. You see this in St. John of the Cross and also Teresa of Avila and her visions, moving away from the traditional avenues of the Church, not necessarily pursuing all these prescriptions and regulations the Catholic Church advocated to draw near to God. They seek mystical or more alternative means. There's a great desire for spirituality, even as they acknowledge the Church is quite corrupt. When the Protestant Reformation breaks out across the continent, there are many Catholic officials who seek for a council to be called immediately to deal with the Protestant threat and not to let it grow and fester. But the Pope, Paul III, mid-century, is very slow in calling for a council. One of the problems the Catholic Church faces in meeting the threat of the Protestants is that many of their popes don't last very long. Their pontificates are very short. And so there is not a sustained response to the emerging Protestant rebellion in the 16th century by the Catholic Church. Finally, in 1545, this is 24 years after the Diet of Worms and Luther's famous stand, the Council of Trent is famously called. At Trent, initially, the council is led by a lot of conservatives, a lot of reformers who are interested in reforming the church. They sincerely take a look at Protestant doctrine and believe that perhaps the church does need to be reformed. But later on, conservatives take control of the council, and in the end, they examine all forms of Catholic teaching and affirm everything. Essentially, they don't change anything. Including clerical celibacy, the seven sacraments, transubstantiation, purgatory indulgences. All these things are affirmed. They still declare that only the Church can interpret Scripture, and faith and good works are necessary for salvation. The only thing that the Council at Trent admits is that the sale of indulgences has gotten out of control and it has been corrupt, and they call for it to be reeled in. One of the most prominent leaders of the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation is St. Ignatius of Loyola. Loyola was a Spanish soldier who is injured in battle. During his convalescence in a military hospital, he believes he has visions of Christ, and he is miraculously healed, and he pledges personal loyalty to the Pope, not to the Church or to Catholic doctrine, but to the Pope. His famous devotional of his experience is called The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius. And in the spiritual exercises, St. Ignatius of Loyola declares his complete loyalty to the Pope. And even if something seems very black or white, whatever the Pope declares, then it is true. You're never to criticize the Pope, and we ought to praise frequently Catholic doctrine. And so this leads to the formation of the Society of Jesus, also called the Jesuits. The Jesuits become one of the most feared organizations in Protestant circles because the goals of the Jesuits are to reform and educate the Catholic priesthood, to spread Catholicism to native peoples around the globe and also combat the spread of Protestantism, particularly in Europe. Thus, we see Jesuit missionaries going to the New World and to the Far East, including Francis Xavier, who will travel all the way to Japan, Matteo Ricci, who will go to China, and then, of course, all those Jesuit missions that are established in the New World, including missions at the Alamo and also other settlements such as San Diego and San Francisco and Los Angeles on the California coast in Spain's empire in the New World. The Jesuits also assist in the establishment of the Inquisition. There is a papal Inquisition in Rome and also the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition for a time is led by the very brutal and feared Tomás de Torquemada, who was the chief inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition would target Protestants, Jews, Muslims, heretics, excommunicates, often torturing them without a trial, demanding their conversion to the Catholic Church, or they would be executed. So the Jesuits operate as a fifth column movement, almost a spy organization in a lot of Protestant countries, trying to root out Protestantism. And this is Elizabeth is particularly aware of this and suspicious of them and their activities in England. Part of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church also produces the Index of Forbidden Books, which is a list of tracts and pamphlets and writings and books which devout Catholics are forbidden from reading. This would also, of course, include the writings of Luther and Zwingli, also the Institutes of the Christian Religion, but also some scientific works such as the works of Galileo that devout Catholics are forbidden from reading. Of course, in the end, the Counter-Reformation is largely unsuccessful, and Protestantism grabs a firm hold in much of Europe by century's end. Last note we ought to mention about the Reformation is the rise of witchcraft. There is a stunning rise in witchcraft accusations, trials, and also executions during the time period we would identify as the Reformation. A lot of explanations have been offered regarding these trials, including religious wars, economic hardships, social upheaval. But between 1500 and 1650, approximately 100,000 Europeans were accused of witchcraft. 60,000 of them were executed. The stereotype of the early modern witch is an old, poor woman, particularly in a war-ravaged area. The most significant publication for the exposure and trial and execution of witches was the Malleus Maleficarum, which meant the Hammer of Witches, 1487, written by two inquisitors that refuted arguments against witchcraft, exposed witchcraft, identified them more as women than men, and educated magistrates on how to find, identify, and convict the witches. This, of course, leads to the witchcraft craze. So as a result, many of the crimes that witches are accused of include swearing allegiance to the devil, attending a witches' sabbat, which is a meeting of witches at night, orgies and sex with the devil, hexes, curses, potions placed on neighbors. This is a popular depiction of a witches' sabbath at the time. A lot of young women are examined for marks of the devil, and witches are brutally tortured and often executed during the midst of the witch craze. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century has enormous implications for subsequent history. There is a profound legacy of the Protestant Reformation. Perhaps one of the most significant legacies of the Protestant Reformation is a new positive attitude towards the world. Remember, during the Middle Ages, that the average medieval mind looked very poorly against this life, believing this life is so full of plague and war and disease and death. You will not live long, therefore focus on the afterlife, stay in the good graces of the church. Don't focus on improving your life here because it's so temporal and short-lived anyway. The Reformation changes that with a new positive attitude towards the world, which leads to other important ideas, including the Protestant work ethic and the importance of thrift, working hard in order to get ahead. Some would see in that some of the origins of the ideas of capitalism, a new attention to human rights, the individual, um, the priesthood of all believers, that idea that an individual can encounter God, does not need a mediator in the form of the church or pope or religious activity, but rather Christ alone is the only mediator. We've already talked about the political legacy of the Reformation, including the contract theory of government, which emerges with the Monarchies in the French Wars of Religion, has enormous implications for Enlightenment thought and also the American Revolution. A new attention to the natural sciences and the world that needs to be discovered as a beautiful creation of the hand of God himself. The Reformation completely changes attitudes towards marriage. Marriage was viewed very negatively during the Middle Ages as something only commoners or the less holy would participate in. Commensurate with that is a new perception on the dignity of women, their role as homemakers and wives and mothers, and also those with individual consciousness who are accountable to God. The Reformation also provides a new positive view towards sexuality, not as a medieval carnal reluctant necessity, but rather a gift and delight enjoyed by married couples, which was fundamental to Reformation thought, which also leads to a positive view of the role of the family in childbirth and raising children together, the responsibility of parents to raise children in righteousness and in the gospel and in the reading of the scriptures, and not the role necessarily of the church. The Reformation leads to an explosion of literacy, including a new focus on literature, new attention to music, including congregational singing, as opposed to simply choirs or a medieval priest chanting. We see changes in art and in architecture, also attitudes towards death. So fundamental to the Reformation, particularly, is this idea of the priesthood of all believers, that an individual can encounter God directly, specifically, individually, and does not need the mediation of the church, a priest, a pope, or religious exercises. That is a very important idea, which leads to additional study, individuality, and invention, entrepreneurship, also discovery and scientific investigation, with this solidifying of the importance of the idea of the individual. All these are important legacies of the 16th century Protestant Reformation.